Hi, my name is Rebecca Wilson. I am the daughter of Stephen Wilson and his wife Karen Wilson, who was born Karen Munson. My grandfather on my father's side is Daniel Wilson and his wife Garnetta Wilson. I am making this documentary with my husband Daniel Baker in order to explore the Wilson heritage. Here in Harrodsburg, Kentucky, to explore the place where our family stories begin. I have heard the Wilson family stories my whole life and have always wanted to record them. The reason for this is because I believe in the importance of passing down our family stories. Some of them may be true and some of them may be folklore, and the folklore is just as important as the verifiable stories in the way that it contributes to our family identity. I hope that you can connect with our family stories and remember to pass on family stories of your own.
I met one of my students, Karen Ann Munson, and we eventually married. We were a student-teacher romance. And we married in 1986. In 1987, we had a daughter, Rebecca Ann Wilson, and 3 years later, we had my son, Daniel Stewart Wilson, who is named for both my father as well as my brother. And so I had a family life. I've been involved in just one marriage to my wife, Karen, had 2 kids, and they had a boy each, Peter for Rebecca, and Brian for Daniel. And Daniel and his wife Melissa, they have another baby on the way. And I think that's going to be a baby girl. They're going to name it Lillian.
Hello, I'm Stuart Wilson. My parents are Dan and Garnetta Wilson, and I have siblings of Stephen, Elaine, and Becky.
Rebecca Browning Wilson Wharton. My parents are Daniel William Wilson and Garnetta Hardin Wilson. My siblings include my oldest brother, Stephen, my older sister, Elaine, and then I'm next. I'm the third child. And then Stuart will be our youngest brother.
In what used to be the cemetery of the Bohan Methodist Church. We are in the little hamlet of Bohan, Kentucky. At one time it had its own post office. He, of course, was its postmaster general. I'm surrounded by unmarked graves of a lot of his children who died in infancy and their teenage years. On the website that we have their names, but only a few of his children lived into adulthood. The Wilson family story begins in this county with Thomas Wilson, who apparently was a landowner in both Jessamine County, which is today Nicholasville, and also in Mercer County. We do not know much about him. There is actually some thought on genealogical websites that there are possible many Thomas Wilsons that were in early Kentucky. But we do have his will where he talks about the land that he had in Mercer County. And it also talks about, well, it says in Collins History, Kentucky, that there was a Thomas Wilson and he was staying in Daniel Boone's cabin, but while Boone was away, he burned it down. I'm sure it was an accident. The problem is I later found out there were many Thomas Wilsons, and the genealogical sites that I refer to are not quite sure which Thomas Wilson that it was. So that part, although that's a family legend, we don't know if it was the Thomas Wilson, because there were many Thomas Wilsons in early Kentucky.
Do you know if the dates line up as being possible for it to have been our time, Thomas Wilson?
Yes, but it was, Thomas Wilson was in early pioneer times, lived until the early 1800s. We have a will of him. We can verify that he was in Jessamine and Mercer counties, but like I said, there were many Thomas Wilsons in those counties. You got to remember, Wilson is a very common last name.
Who founded Harrodsburg?
That was James Harrod, and apparently Thomas Wilson named one of his sons Harrod Wilson, who was a brother of James. And we know that Harrod Wilson was also living in Mercer County, and James Wilson is mentioned in his will as well. So we have the Wilsons early on in Mercer County. Early on, there was some connection to the Harrod family, and possibly to Daniel Boone's family as well. That his son James was willed a powder factory that made gunpowder that James ran, and James, we know, was one of his children that was born in 1798. So Wilsons in Mercer County actually began in the 1700s, in the early days of settlement. My ancestor, my great-great-grandfather, James Wilson, was born in 1798, and he was born in Kentucky, according to the census reports. And we have census reports on him all the way to 1870, where he is still recorded as living. He would pass away in 1878. His life was rather remarkable because it spanned the period from pioneer times all the way through the Civil War and Reconstruction. He was a remarkable man. He married twice. His first wife was named Amanda Hampton in Jessamine County. We have records verifying that. But either she left or died, and he remarried Jane Threlkeld in the 1840s. He would produce many children, but a lot of them, although they're mentioned in census report, were not mentioned in later census reports. We believe they may have passed away. His son also had a lot of children that passed away. James was a carpenter, a cabinet maker. He ran a store in Bohan, Kentucky, and he also was the postmaster general for the Bohan area. So this was the life of Thomas and James Wilson. He is buried in Bohan. My family later, it was unmarked, but my family, they put up a headstone for both he and his wife, who were buried in the old Bohan Methodist Church cemetery. That church is now gone, but the cemetery still exists. During the Civil War, he was a pro-Southern sympathizer. And so he lost his job as Postmaster General, which after all is on the federal payroll, because he ran the post office out of his store. And while the Union Army, of course, was in control of Harrodsburg through much of the Civil War and also a little bit in Reconstruction, he was out of a job. But later on, when the Democrats took back control, he got his job back as Postmaster General. In the Harrodsburg post office, there's a list of all the postmasters in the county, and James Wilson is listed among them. Daniel Threlkeld did a number of things that are interesting. He was the son of James Wilson. He was born in 1852, which was 9 years before the Civil War. And after the war, he married Elizabeth Burns. Now what's interesting is, during the Civil War, Elizabeth Burns' father, William Harvey Burns, was the head of the local Union militia. And when John Hunt Morgan's Confederate cavalry came through, he fled with his command. And when the Confederates left, he got back in control. So he was the head of the Union Home Guard. So ironically, even though Daniel Threlkeld's father, James Wilson, was a pro-Southern sympathizer, he allowed his son to marry the daughter of the man who was the head of the local Union militia. That was called the Home Guard. And he too was a cabinet maker, a carpenter. But eventually he came to specialize in building barns. Only one of the barns that he built, however, is still standing. That became what he did for a number of years. But eventually he decided to go for elective office, and he became, for a number of years, the Mercer County coroner. And he had a long career in the local Democratic Party establishment, because he was a long-time officer holder as coroner. But in 1828, because of his strong Presbyterian roots, and they were in favor of prohibition, he broke with the party and endorsed Herbert Hoover for president. When he did, his own son, Peter Nolan Wilson, who was involved in Democratic Party politics, he favored Al Smith, the Democratic candidate, and it caused a rift between the father and son. However, the local Democratic Party no longer thought he should be supported as coroner, and so eventually he was no longer coroner. He either stepped down or was defeated. In the late 19 teens, the Wilson family moved here. Peter Nolan moved his family here, and my father, Daniel Wilson, was born when they had this house. They kept it until 1936, when the bank took it during the Great Depression, because Mr. Peter Nolan lost his business. And after that, they moved somewhere on Price Avenue. But this was the Wilson home. Its original color was white, but during its tenure, it's been green, and now this color here, which is something in between magenta and purple. I don't know what color, but that would be. Peter Nolan Wilson was one of the later children of Daniel Threlkeld. Again, a lot of those children died in epidemics and so forth. The oldest son actually was a veteran of the Spanish-American War, Franklin Pierce Wilson. But he died in 1906, I believe, of typhus shortly after he had married. Peter Nolan inherited, now for at least the third generation, a proclivity for building. But he specialized in building a lot of public buildings, like churches, courthouses, schools. And he did a number of these big projects. Many of these are still standing. Now, the Mercer County Courthouse and the Camp Dick Robinson School have been torn down. But his post office, Fort Herod, some houses, and a big church out there near Bohan that he did. I think it's called Bethel Baptist. These were all built by Peter Nolan Wilson. He was Mercer County's contractor. He was a remarkable builder. He had a crew of white carpenters, but a lot of his stonemasons were black, even though some of the stonemasons were also white, including my Uncle Bill, who married a daughter of Peter Nolan. And he was active in many political party decisions. He was a loyal Democrat, and he played a role in Democratic Party politics kind of behind the scenes. He was never an office holder, with the exception of being the fire chief at that time. And I think it was more or less a kind of volunteer fire department. He was the fire chief of Harrodsburg at that time, continuing some of the civic work that his father had done. He fathered 5 children, and these were my aunts and uncles, like my Uncle Woodrow Wilson and my aunts, Eula Virginia Wilson, Mary Wilson, who later she was Mary Lou Wilson, my aunt Rebecca Wilson. One of many Rebeccas. Daniel and Rebecca are a lot of the repeating names in this line. He did a number of other things that were prominent in the community. He got cancer and passed away right on the eve of World War II with cancer. Lucretia Browning, who later became known as Two Mama, was the daughter of William Browning, who was a farm manager in various counties. And eventually he came here and was a farm manager. And his daughter was Lucretia Wilson. She married Peter Nolan Wilson in the early part of the 20th century. And as I've said, they had 5 kids. Among them was my father, who was the baby of the family. Because of their background and the fact that Peter Nolan was a rather prominent citizen in the early part of the 20th century, they were actually, according to the family, and that's all I have, they were the first people in Mercer County to have a car, an automobile. And Two Mama, as we called her, and I'll tell you that story in a moment, Lucretia Browning, she actually drove her father-in-law, Daniel Threlkeld, to a lot of his appointments. When there was somebody who had passed away, she would drive him in the car. And so that was really interesting that apparently, according to my family, they were the first family in Mercer County to have a car. Well, eventually, the oldest daughter, Eula Virginia Wilson, married William Freeman, and they had a child that they named Nolan Wilson Freeman. And lo and behold, his mother, my Aunt Eula, she was out a lot with her husband. They were going on out of town trips. My Uncle Bill was a bricklayer as well as a contractor, and they would be gone a lot. And so young Nolan was kind of left in the care of Lucretia Browning Wilson, his grandmother. Well, eventually, little Nolan recognized the fact that in effect he had two mamas. And so he would call one of them Mama, and the other one, his grandmother, he would call Two Mama. The name stuck, and all the Wilson grandchildren, including me and my sisters and my brother, we all referred to her as Two Mama. That was the only name we knew her by. And so it is said that you can't make a child pick your grandparents' name that they come up with. And sure enough, you see that a lot, and that is why children will come up with just some of the silliest names for grandparents. But mine is the silliest that I've ever heard, and that is, I recognize no other family that ever called their grandmother Two Mama, but it was mine. Two Mama would live through much of the 20th century. After her husband passed away, she befriended the local Catholic priest, and she eventually converted to Catholicism. Some of her daughters, particularly one in particular, did not want to have Catholic rites for her at her funeral, but my father intervened and said that was her wish, and he made sure that that she had Catholic rites at her funeral.
My grandmother, which we call Two Mama, was named by her first grandchild, Nolan Freeman. And Nolan, in meeting her and interacting with her, thought he had two mothers, his mother and then his grandmother, which was later named Two Mama by him. Two Mama passed away when I was 12, so I do have memories of her. There are two that stand out. One was that she was a very giving person. If you ever went to her home, no matter how valuable an item was, and you showed any interest in it or you said you liked it, it would be yours. And second of all, Two Mama was she was very beautiful, very pretty. And it's a shame that her life was cut short due to a surgery that went wrong.
Dad was the youngest son of Peter Nolan Wilson. He was especially close with his mother. But the big events of his life would happen in the 1940s. And certainly the big event for any young man who grew up at that time would have been World War II. Dad joined the Army Air Corps. And he thought that would be interesting to be a pilot. And he, however, was very mischievous. And as he was learning to fly planes, he at one time was stationed fairly close to here at some airfield near Nashville. And he would steal these $1 million planes. And he would call and tell his sisters, "Y'all meet me at the water tower and wave red handkerchiefs at me, and I'm going to come there and fly around the water tower and then head back to base." And so he would in effect steal these planes for joyriding. And sure enough, it would take, I think Dad said it would take an hour and a half from Nashville with one of those planes. I don't know if that was fast or slow. And sure enough, he would make it here, and the sisters would tell people that that he was coming, and they would gather around the water tower, and Dad would circle around in his plane and then head back to Nashville. Well, eventually he got caught at this, and so they sent him elsewhere, and he continued to do things like that down there. And finally, they decided that probably his flying days were nearing an end. he was commissioned as a second lieutenant. And there was some thought that he had become first lieutenant, which is a higher rank, but we never found a record of it. And eventually, his last assignment was governing or watching over Italian prisoners of war at a camp in Nebraska. Now, the Italians would tell him that, we're Italians, we're lovers, we're not fighters. And so Dad is watching over these men. Well, one day these Italians had been talking to these American girls on the other side of the barbed wire. And they approached Dad, wanting to know if Dad would let them out at night so they could date these American girls. And they promised to come back to the camp in the morning. And Dad says, well, you're prisoners of war. I can't do this. But remember, Dad had kind of a mischievous streak. And they said, well, wait a minute, we got one for you. And he goes, you got a girl for me? He goes, yeah, you can come with us. And so Dad would sneak them out at night. Dad had some deal with the guy guarding the gate. And lo and behold, he and these Italian prisoners of war would go on dates. Well, pretty soon, I think, according to Dad, he tired of going on these dates. And the Italian prisoners of war would now come to him and they would say, well, can you still let us out? And he says, sure, but you got to come back in the morning. And he would also get them to do things for him, like shiny shoes and that kind of thing, so they could have suspended money. Because these Italian prisoners of war told him that, gosh, these American girls, they want you to spend a lot of money on them. And so Dad would find, not only from him, but for other guys in the camp, to be able to give them little odd jobs so they could have money to go and date these American girls. Well, after the war, some of them actually wanted to marry some of these American girls. And my dad actually wrote some letters of commendation for them, and they got to stay in the United States, thanks to Dad's testimony and the fact that these girls wanted to marry these Italian prisoners of war.
I learned about, my father rarely spoke to me about his military service. I guess it was a subject I wasn't interested in, and I know very little, but I do remember seeing his uniform hanging in our closet. I always thought he was in the Air Force, but he wasn't, because when he went to serve, the Air Force fell under the Army, so it was a corps, the Army Corps that he served in.
I have heard a story about him guarding prisoners of war. However, I can't verify any of that information. There was a story about my father piloting a B-24 over Harrodsburg, Kentucky, and he lined up the plane with the water tower there in Harrodsburg. And people on the second story windows literally saw the plane eye level of him buzzing the city of Harrodsburg. He spotted his oldest sister Eula and his mother in the yard waving dishcloths at him. And that is all of the story that I know verbally from my father. He was in the United States Army Air Corps. My father, Daniel Wilson, served in World War II. He never left the shores of the United States, though. He worked in the Army for about 1.5 years. However, I do have all of the documentation of his service in a file at home. He went to school at Catawba College in South Carolina. That's spelled C-A-T-W-A-B-A. And we were always told that he received an associate's degree, but it was only for 6 months, and they crammed all of that course into that period of time. Then he learned how to fly, starting with a biplane here in the United States.
The next defining event in my father's life was when he came home. And what he came home to in Mercer County was beginning to convert away from an agricultural market town. And at that time, there were 8 or 9 tobacco warehouses in Harrodsburg. And the only work that Dad could find after being an officer in World War II was sweeping out a tobacco warehouse. So that's what he was doing. Well, one day, a couple of executives from Liggett Myers Tobacco Company, that's who Dad later worked for, they came to meet the owner of the warehouse about some business about tobacco, because the tobacco companies were buying burley, and they would mix it with other tobaccos and to make cigarettes. Well, that gentleman wasn't there, just Dad was there. Well, Dad started entertaining them and telling stories and telling jokes. And remember, he was a bit of a comedian, based on what I was telling you about his World War II experience. And they said, you know what? You're just the very kind of guy we need to go buy Turkish tobacco in Turkey. Are you interested? And Dad said yes. Remember, he was a single man. This sounded like an adventure. And lo and behold, they offered him a job to do that. And he said, but you'll have to leave this town and go to New York City and learn Turkish before we can send you over. He agreed to do it. He took his mother, Lucretia Browning Wilson, with him. She was a widow by then. And he took her to Turkey to kind of be the woman of the house. And he would stay there 4 years, only occasionally coming home to do leave. And while he was over there, again, he continued some of this mischievous activity. When they were over there, the Turkish government had a monopoly on tobacco. And they made this brand of cigarettes, which was the only cigarettes that you could buy. And my father and his American and British friends and a Greek friend that worked for him, they hated these Turkish cigarettes. So they decided to go in the smuggling business. And my father and his friend, Dick Brooking from Lexington, and this Greek man, Kimon Palomides, they went into the smuggling business, and they would smuggle American-style cigarettes produced by the Liggett Myers Tobacco Company. And they would smuggle them into Turkey. Now, again, my dad, if you'll recall, he bribed the camp guards to get the Italian prisoners of war out. Well, he bribed the harbor master to look the other way while they smuggled in these cigarettes. And so my father was a smuggler. Well, he continued his job with the tobacco company, and then the Cold War broke out. That ideological conflict between the Soviet Union and the United States. And Turkey was located right next to the Black Sea, where there was Turkish activity in both the air and also Turkish ships in the Black Sea. Well, they came to him and asked him to be, in effect, a spy. This was a CIA operation, but Dad was not part of the CIA. He just reported to a man that was. And what Dad would do is they told him if there's Russian planes or ships that you see, to report them to it. And so Dad would. He actually had to drive a piece to report into this man who was an actual agent. And he would dutifully report everything he saw, mostly shipping, but occasionally a plane. Well, one day when Dad was on his job selling tobacco, a Russian pilot had defected to the Turks with their brand new jet plane they had. These were called MiGs. If you'll recall, the Germans had jet planes first. The Americans and the British were experimenting with them, but didn't actually produce any that saw combat during World War II that I'm aware of. And the Russians were way behind. They did not produce these until the late 40s. But this Russian pilot in a MiG had defected. And Dad, by then, had befriended a lot of Turkish military men. And so he went to one of them and said, could I take possession of this plane for the American government? They told him, no, we want this plane for our Air Force. At that time, the Turkish government only had prop planes. So my dad said, could I look at it and take pictures? And they said yes, that it could. And so my father produced, according to my father, and you got to remember, a lot of these are family stories. My brother got his military record, and it's useless. All of it is blacked out, particularly the part when he was in Turkey. Because technically, Dad was still kind of activated, because they were using that to kind of give him some money. So anyway, according to Dad, he was one of the first people that ever documented the new generation of Soviet MiG planes. And so my father said that he was one of the first to actually see one of these planes, or one of these jet planes. He continued doing that. But as I told you, he had three big events during the 40s. In the late 40s, he had a third very important event in his life. In the late 1940s, my father had the third biggest event in his life that was really going to be an influence for the rest of his life. And that is, he came home on leave from working for the tobacco company, and he saw a young lady that was walking, not hitching, just walking back from town back to her house. She was going to her father's place on Parable Street. The family was very poor. My grandfather never owned a car, and the only reason why they had that nice house on Parable Street is because one of his sons, James Leslie Hardin, was killed in the war. And in World War II, every GI had a $10,000 insurance policy. And lo and behold, it was with that they were able to buy that house on Parable Street. And the house still stands. In fact, it's the only house the Hardin family ever lived in that's still around today. They saw each other, and my mother, who would have just never have done this, she got in the car with Dad, but she thought it was his brother Woodrow that she knew, and she knew the family. Her brother, by the way, little Bruce Hardin, actually did their lawn. He would mow their lawn with no push mower. When she got in the car, she realized it was not Woodrow, but the young man dropped her off at the house, and it seemed pretty nice. Dad went home and told the woman I call Two Mama, his mother, Lucretia Browning Wilson. He goes, I just met the woman I want to marry. And my dad pursued her. But the Hardins, particularly my mother and her mother, were very religious. And Dad would go to kiss her, and she would turn away from him. She didn't want to kiss him. And so eventually she told her aunts about this that she was very close to, her Aunt Garney and her Aunt Crenna. And even her mother said, it's all right if you kiss him. And so my Aunt Garney, my Aunt Crenna, made her write a letter to my father that they put in the mail, that if he would ask her out again, she would kiss him. And lo and behold, he showed up at the house smiling, and that night was the first time that my mother ever let my dad kiss her. But it was the intervention of those aunts that said, Garnetta, that was her name, you're being a little silly. And when Dad arrived, he was just happy as a lark, knowing that he was going to get a kiss. And they met, and Dad told her that I want to continue my job in Turkey, and she didn't know about that. But he promised her a European honeymoon. I said, on our way back over to Turkey, I will take you on a European honeymoon. And she agreed to marry him. And on August the 20th, 1950, they were married at the Harrodsburg Christian Church. I have their wedding album is in my possession, and I know most of the people that are in it.
You know, I've heard this story about my dad. When he was in his house, my mother walked down the street, and my mother always told me, sit up straight, sit up straight. And when she walked very erect, with her back very erect. She was very proud, a real proud person. And she was walking down the street holding her head up. And my dad looked out the window and he says, who is that little girl? He goes, I'm going to marry her one day. And at that time, they hadn't even met yet. But they did end up meeting and marrying.
The story goes that he saw Garnetta walking down a city street, and he went home. He first of all stopped and picked her up and took her home. And then later, Dad went home, told his mother that that's the girl he's going to marry.
Mom and Dad had very different personalities. My mom was a little more introverted than my father. She was the saver of the family, and Dad was the spender. And Mama played a big role in our lives. She had high hopes for us. She encouraged me to eventually do well in school. She was a stay-home mom, as most of the moms of the baby boomers were. In those days, you only needed one person working to make a decent income. And so my mother stayed at home. She never worked after she married. Well, after their European honeymoon, my parents went to Turkey, where my father worked as a tobacco buyer for the Liggett Myers Tobacco Company. He worked with an international team. There were people from France and Britain and Greece and Bulgaria that worked with the Americans in the company. They both loved Turkey, and my mother and father spent 2 more years there. My father spending a total of 6 years. They adjusted well. Dad knew the language. My mother knew enough conversational Turkish to like go to the market and that sort of thing. But while they were there, they were pregnant with me and my twin. And my mother did not want them to be born in a Muslim country. She wanted them to be born in the States. So she wanted to go home. My father didn't initially want to do this. He wanted to stay. And so they worked it out where she would go back to the States and stay with her father, who lived on Perryville Street in Harrodsburg. And Dad stayed there till the night before I was born. And he knocked on the door on May 2nd and said, I'm back. And I was born on May the 3rd. I had a twin who was stillborn.
Mom, of course, when she married, she was maybe 5'6" in height, but she's always told me she weighed 109 pounds. So for a frame of a 5'6" height, that's a very skinny person. And within 2 years of her marriage, Mom has her pregnancy over in Turkey. But it was quite a difficult pregnancy, being that she was very ill. She was throwing up a lot. She could not keep food down, nor did she enjoy the food over there, and she could not sustain her weight. She had a really hard time, and Dad and them had made the decision that she needs to return to the States to stabilize her health and for the health of the unborn child. My father had served in the what I call the Air Force. And after being in multiple states, multiple big metropolis cities, to return back to Harrodsburg, where nothing was going on, my dad was itching to continue his life of excitement. And he had seen a poster about Leggett & Myers, which was a tobacco company, that was located in Turkey was going to hire it. And my dad happened to show up, and sure enough, Dad became a part of Leggett and Myers, but was assigned to their Turkish division, where he would purchase tobacco. Campbell cigarettes were Turkish tobacco. That was one of the products that they made, and they marketed under different names as well. My dad, after he had already been very ill, and he was up into his 70s, it wasn't until then that I heard stories about how he reported on the Black Sea. And it was just something I'd never heard before. Maybe it was a military secret he was to take to his grave, because it was a secretive mission. But one day we walked in, and he was at the University of Kentucky, which is a learning medical center. So they have students from all over the world that do get educated there. And this lady was from Turkey, and I walked in, and Dad was speaking perfect Turkish to this I guess by then she was a resident doctor, and she had originated from Turkey, and they were both speaking Turkish as if they were sitting there in Turkey just talking away. And it was something still in his mind that he still, from what I have heard, his dad picked up the Turkish language very easily. And I even have his language book. They gave him a book before he was to go over there, and it had the English names and the Turkish translations. And he studied that, and then he became very well immersed with the language once he got to Turkey, and spoke it very well. Because growing up, he would still have guests come over to the States, and he would sometimes speak Turkish to them, and Dad was very fluent in the language. My mother was a different story. She'd never even been out of the state of Kentucky till she met my father. And her honeymoon was a 1-month grand vacation, European vacation. And to be her first time out of the States, or even to go anywhere, she had a fabulous overseas trip. But Mom did not adapt well to the culture in Turkey. She wasn't fond of the food. She would even try to go to the markets because she didn't speak the language. Now, she did have a cook that would take her to the markets, where they would go out, and she would try to teach Mom how to go out and get the foods that she needed, but they weren't the foods that Mom was used to here in Kentucky.
My mother loved turkey. She was not able to speak the language fluently, but she would say that she learned Turkish in the kitchen. So she was able to communicate with the cooks in Turkish, but she called it kitchen Turkish. She loved the people. She loved everything about it. And you have to imagine a girl coming out of Harrodsburg, Kentucky, traveling on a steamship all the way halfway across the world, and then landing in an Arabic country. And it was a huge change for her, but she absolutely loved it and adopted it as her home. The information I have of my dad reporting on Russian airplanes during the war, or prior to the war, or thereafter the war, I have no information on that. I was under the impression that he watched for military maritime vessels and not aircraft. The information I have of my dad reporting on Russian air.
So, you've met a lot of famous people, so much that Mom refers to you sometimes as Forrest Gump. Tell us some of the famous people you have met and some of those interesting stories.
Well, there's a number of people that ran into. It was serendipitous. It wasn't anything planned. But I worked with Colonel Sanders at a Kentucky Fried Chicken in Lexington. And Colonel Sanders thought I was funny. And so he always had me come in the back and cut up chicken. In those days, they delivered whole chickens to the Kentucky Fried Chicken places. And they cut them up on a bandsaw, and the colonel would do that. And all he had me do was just talk to him while he was doing that. And he thought I was funny, and I had to tell him stories. And so eventually I quit there, and one day I was out in the restaurant with my family, and the colonel saw me and motioned for me to come back and cut up chicken with him. And I looked at the manager nodded his head as if to say, we'll give you something for doing this. And even though I no longer worked there, one last time I went back in the back with the colonel while he cut up chicken. I also met King Hussein of Jordan when I was on a Middle East tour. And a girl in our party was a nurse, and she wanted to go to a Jordanian hospital. So one had just opened up, and while we were out in front, a limousine pulled up, and it was King Hussein of Jordan. And he was interested in the young girl in our party, who was a nurse. And so he offered to take her a tour of the hospital, which is the reason why he was there, was to check it out. And so I got to follow along as kind of a third wheel while he toured the hospital with this nurse. So that was interesting. I met Burt Reynolds, the actor, in Florida, and he had a home in the community where I taught. And one day I went to McDonald's for lunch, and he walked in, and he was talking to me, and we were in line together, and he asked me, "What do you do?" And I said, "Well, I'm a school teacher." And he said, "Well, you look like a school teacher." And so then we got our lunches, and I noticed when he went to the counter, he ordered for him and this woman that he was with. It was no famous actress. It was just a young woman. And they got their meal free. They just took their sacks and walked off. And then I was behind them. And so they gave me my sack of food to take out. And I said, "Well, how much?" And they said, "Well, not anything. You're with Bert." And I went, yes, that's right. And I walked on out, and I got my meal taken care of because they thought I was with Burt Reynolds. If you know Oprah Winfrey, you know that she has a longtime companion named Stedman. Well, I was in a motel in Louisville, and he was speaking that night to a group of educators, and he had a book he wanted to promote. And I saw it out in the hall where he had all the books stacked, but he didn't know where it was. He was lost. And so he asked me, "Do you know where I'm supposed to be at, where my books are?" And I told him I was not an employee of the hotel, but I knew where it was. And I led him to where his books were stacked, where he was going to give a talk and sell some of the books. And so I met Margaret Thatcher, but that was much in the same vein as if you were to go to a concert or something like that. I went to see her. We did not have a meeting by accident. I actually went to hear her speak in Missouri. 3 degrees from the University of Kentucky, a BA, an MA, a Master of Arts, and a PhD, and I majored in history. And it took me 4 years to get a full-time job, but that was at Alice Lloyd College. And once you're a college professor, it's thought that you have to publish. And so I published a book called In the Fullness of Time, about an historical look at the early life of Christ. I also was a participant in writing 2 articles for the Kentucky Encyclopedia. And also, I was one of the contributing authors in a book about famous Baptist preachers in Kentucky. In my capacity for the Baptist Press, I was kind of an historian for them. I did their historical pieces, and I wrote a number of articles. I've also had some articles in what are called referee journals. That is when people read your works and experts in the field pass on them. And so I've had a number of them on various subjects. American ancient history, which is what I really love, and also works about holidays and culture. I have another article coming out next year in 2025 about Alice Lloyd College during the Depression in a volume published, I believe, by the University of Kentucky Press about Appalachia during the Depression. I was a fan of the Beach Boys, as were all the kids, except Stewart. He came along later. I had two sisters, Elaine and Becky, and a brother by the name of Stewart. And so I wanted to go to the Beach Boy concert in Richmond, Kentucky, at their auditorium there. In those days, a concert ticket was $5. And so my dad took us there, and we saw the Beach Boys. And Dad and I, for some reason, went out one exit, and they went out the other exit. Well, my mom went out with my sister Elaine and a little girl down the street by the name of Debbie Pointer, and they were lost and didn't know where the parking lot was, and so they saw this limousine there. My mother went up and tapped on the window. They had somehow got behind a barricade, and the people in the car were the Beach Boys. They were in a limousine, and she asked, "You know how to get to the parking lot?" And Mike Love, one of the Beach Boys, said, "I think it's that way." And they walked behind the barricades and found their way to the car. And so my mother and my sister got to see the Beach Boys up front and personal, while Dad and I did not. Up front and personal, while Dad and I did not.